Do you all remember when I talked about the time that I was in a role and I spent my first handful of weeks doing 6,000 pieces of outbound and not hearing anything? If you didn't check out that episode, make sure you check it out afterwards and I'll give you some additional context. But to give you the TLDR, I was brought into an executive coaching organization. They had an established playbook. That playbook was built in a boardroom and not battle tested against what works out in the wild. And I executed that playbook for the first 3 weeks and did 6,000 pieces of outbound across multiple channels and heard nothing. It was a completely terrifying moment because here I am brought in as a director of global new business development, and I'm trying to execute a playbook that is not based in any form of reality that we're used to. And it completely falls over. And it forced me to think outside of the box. So the reason why I bring that up is because we've all faced those circumstances as founders and maybe even as individual contributors and salespeople where we're executing somebody else's playbook and we just keep banging our head against the wall and not making any progress whatsoever. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's also a mistake that a lot of early founders make when they think about accelerating into the marketplace. You've gotten a few wins under your belt, gotten a handful of renewals, you seem to be getting traction, you think you have the playbook figured out, so now it's time to hire a CRO or an SDR team or a combination of both and start really scaling up. And this is where everything can go sideways. Because if you haven't validated everything through the process and you haven't really nailed why you had those wins, you're setting up that new CRO or that SDR team or both for complete failure. In this conversation, I'm going to talk about how you can actually structure your outbound efforts differently so that it doesn't completely crush your sales team. And it actually gets you further along the path of having an established playbook that you can hand off to that new sales leader that comes in or the SDR team that you want to execute. For those of you where this is your first time seeing me, I'm Dr. Jim. I've spent almost my entire career in spaces where I'm either launching new products, launching new markets, or helping startup founders go from 0 to 1 to growth to traction. And I've done this across a number of different industries. The first experience that I had with this was when I was working in a construction tech company. And then I moved into staffing and did similar things across 2 different companies. I've done that at executive coaching companies, in TA tech and HR tech. So the lanes that I play in typically account for those sorts of B2B spaces. One of the things that I've never talked about on this channel is that part of my background is also terminal research on why salespeople join and leave organizations. My doctoral study is on retention and turnover, and specifically retention and turnover of salespeople and the different things that drive retention and turnover of salespeople. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's tied directly to that example that I gave you. Now, I've been around the block long enough where rejection doesn't bother me. One of the first sales jobs that I had was selling yellow page ads door to door and going from company to company unannounced, walking in and trying to get them to buy ads in the yellow pages. Now, I'm dating myself when I actually give you that example, but that gives you an idea of the toughness and grit that you have to build to continue picking up the phone or walking in that next door to try to build a relationship that positions you well enough to get a sale. That's not everyone's experience. And realistically, most founders that I work with don't come out of the sales space. They actually come out of product in it or engineering or some non-revenue function. And that creates a whole lot of friction when it comes to getting traction in the marketplace. So the reason why I mention all of that, and then the reason why I mention the 6,000 instances of failed outbound, is because imagine if you as a founder, you have those wins under your belt, you feel like you have traction, you think you have the framework of a playbook, and you make that first big hire, first couple big hires, either on the executive side of sales or hiring an SDR team, and you have them execute what you know. Imagine what that person feels like when they come in and experiences that level of failure. It's completely crushing, right? So what I just described is what happens with a lot of founders. They have an incomplete playbook that gives them the illusion of feeling ready. And then they bring in executive leadership on the sales side or an SDR team to help execute the outbound, and everything just falls over because you haven't done this across enough customers to really understand what the real signals are. And if you're tracking with what I'm saying so far, drop me a comment and let me know what was the most frustrating sales experience of your life when you were trying to get traction in the marketplace. And I'll be curious to hear your story. And if you haven't already done so, make sure you give me a follow so that you never miss one of our weekly episodes that comes out. When you have a half-baked playbook like what I just described, you essentially sound like everybody else. Hey, I noticed X. That's a really interesting achievement on your part. Congratulations. By the way, we do ABC, and we've helped companies like XYZ achieve these results. Is that something that's relevant to you, and would you want to have a conversation? Now, let me ask you this. How many of you have seen emails hit your inbox or emails hit your LinkedIn that sound exactly like that? Some trigger, a couple sentences about them, some proof points about companies that you've never heard of, and an ask for a meeting. That's everywhere, right? And that's the kind of messaging and that's the kind of outbound that's going to completely crush your team. And it's also going to do a good job of crushing your reputation because then you're going to be labeled as a spam factory. So what do you need to do differently to get better results? I've been laying the foundation for that across all the episodes that I've dropped so far. And each of those gives you a piece of the foundation that you need to lay to allow you to have more effective outbound. But the reason why I'm so adamant about early stage founders leaning into collaborating with their ICP and doing some deep customer interviews to understand what's moving the market is because of that example that I gave you. What would you rather do? Would you rather spend your time cranking out 6, 10, 12, 20,000 pieces of outbound that get you maybe 1 or 2 conversations? Or would you rather have a small select group of people, let's say under 300, that you've targeted as highly interesting people in the space that you want to get into, who are practitioners, and have really effective multiple conversations with them? I think most people would pick the second option because if you're starting from zero, those 300 conversations are going to teach you a whole lot more than doing all of that outbound to get 1 or 2 conversations every couple of weeks, right? I know what you're thinking right now. You're probably thinking, well, yeah, that sounds great in theory, but how do you get those people to actually raise their hand and want to talk to you? And again, everything that I've laid out prior to this conversation sets the stage for you to be able to do that. And that's the reason why I say long form content as an embedded piece of your outbound strategy informs everything that you do. It informs every piece of outbound messaging. It informs every piece of market research. It informs every sort of market analysis or product analysis that you go through. And it integrates through to that sales process that you're building on the fly. And here's what I mean. You remember that first message that I talked to you about, the structure of it? When I experienced that level of strikeouts, I went a completely different route. So rather than trying another trigger-based or problem-based outbound, I tried something different. But I asked myself the question, how do I get the opportunity to have a conversation with 100% of my market who might be a viable target for my product or service? And that's when I leaned into content. And when I leaned into the content piece of it, what it allowed me to do was reshape my entire messaging. So all of my outbound is about identifying the right guest who's a practitioner for the show that I want them to be on and inviting them onto the show. So my response rate went from less than 1% to, depending on the topic, between 40 and 60%. That set the stage for at least 5 other conversations with each individual as they move through the buyer journey. How much different would your outbound be if you could get 40 to 60% of your targets to raise their hand and say, yeah, I'm interested in talking to you? It would be a game changer, right? Because you're solving the most critical issue that you have to deal with as an early stage founder. As an early stage founder, when you're trying to go from 0 to 1, nobody knows who you are. Nobody's heard about you. Nobody cares what you do. You're just noise. So understanding all of that, getting people to talk to you is 90% of the battle. And that's what this solves. You might be thinking, where are the receipts, Dr. Jim? Well, the receipts are all over LinkedIn, and you can look up shows like Cascading Leadership, HR Impact, Engaging Leadership, and others that I've been a part of, where we are interviewing VPs, CHROs, chief people officers, and other senior and executive leaders on the show as a way to understand what their buyer world looks like and how best we can potentially partner. As a byproduct of all that work, not only were the shows themselves successful and recognized as great shows within their niches, we were able to actually get traction for those different organizations and move them from 0 to 1 to growth to traction. So the reason why I mention all of this is because you want to be really careful about the timing of when you bring on that SDR team or that senior or executive leader to execute the playbook. More often than not, founders who are thinking about that haven't had enough wins and enough conversations with their buyers to understand the full scope of what are the triggers, what are the activation points, why are people actually buying from you, and what were the situations that occurred behind the scenes that moved them into action. Additionally, founders don't have a clear idea, in many cases, of what was the messaging that moved those customers into action and moved them forward into a buying decision. The other part that you have to consider is that most of that early traction that founders get is from referrals or people that they already know, people who already have a relationship with them and are willing to give them a shot. That relying on referrals to continue that growth trajectory isn't a predictable formula. You need to be able to connect with people who don't know you, and you need to understand what's important to them so that you can shape your product, your messaging, your feature set, your problem statements, your validation, all of that stuff around what's important to those strangers who don't know who you are. And that's where all of this comes full circle and puts you in a position to build a playbook that's not going to turn your organization into a revenue side churn factory, meaning you're constantly spending all your time hiring a new CRO or a new VP of sales or a new SDR team, thinking that it's a failure on their part to execute when it's really a gap in the playbook that you have. So before you make the decision to make that big hire or hire that SDR team, you need to make sure that you are super tight on why you got the wins that you got, and you need to be super tight on what your outbound messaging looks like to ensure that the vast majority of people that you want to get in front of are going to raise their hands and say, yeah, I want to talk to these people. Hopefully you found this helpful and it gives you some ideas on how you can shift your messaging to a format that actually gets you a lot more conversations. If you learn nothing else from this conversation, the thing that I want you to take away from it is that you can't go outbound with the noticed an event. We do this, by the way. Would you like to have a conversation format? That's everywhere out there in the world of LinkedIn. And it's going to be something that actually crushes your credibility if you go out in that format because you sound just like everybody else. So thanks for hanging out and checking out this episode. Drop me a comment and let me know what stood out the most for you. If you want to have a more detailed conversation, there's a booking link in the show notes and we can have a conversation about some of the things that you might be facing from an outbound perspective. If you like this conversation, you're going to want to check out this playlist and this episode, and then tune in next time where I'll have another conversation that's going to be important for early stage founders who are trying to go from 0 to 1 to growth to traction.